This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 256 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. So we've gone over team-level regression. We looked at negative regression candidates. And today, on the last Late Round Podcast regression show of the offseason, we're going to look at positive regression candidates. Now remember, positive regression is not the same as progression. Positive regression tells us that a player was more or less unlucky, and then he'll return to a former state. In order to return to that former state, his numbers are going to look better, hence positive and not negative. The term progression actually says that the player got better. Now there are instances where the two things will work together. You might find a second-year player who we're projecting to progress, but all the while, he has some positive regression in his favor as well. It's important to remember the distinction between those two things, though. So we're going to look at some positive regression candidates today. And really, these candidates are mostly guys who were a little bit unlucky in the touchdown column last season. There are plenty of players to choose from, but I wanted to go with the highest impact players that I could find who are in store for some statistical love. Before talking through those players, though, I wanted to send another reminder about the FanDuel and RotoGrinders annual MLB single entry series where there's $64,000 in total prizes. Each week, a new series begins, and your 4 best lineups from that week will count toward the total. The person with the 4 best lineups in a given week will earn a spot in the single entry series championship for a shot at a $10,000 grand prize, and the top 4 spots each week will all win bonus prizes. To get yourself entered in the single entry series presented by RotoGrinders, go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app. Eligibility restrictions apply. Probably the most significant positive regression candidate this season is Ezekiel Elliott. He found the end zone just 6 times on the ground last year, which was a career low. He had 15 his rookie season, 7 in 10 games during 2017, and 6 in 15 games last year. Now you might be thinking that this has to do with Dak Prescott running the football. Dak had 18 more rush attempts last year than he saw in his previous 2 seasons. And he actually had 9 rushes at the goal line or within the opponent's 5-yard line. In his 2 previous seasons, he combined for just 7. I would say that there's significance to that if it actually hurt Zeke's volume, but it didn't. Elliott still had 11 goal line rushes last year when he had 12 and 13 in his previous 2 seasons. He only scored twice from that area of the field, though, last year, and that's the problem. That's the issue. He had 4 scores at the goal line in 2017 and 7 during his rookie season. So his goal line conversion rate was much, much lower last season than in years past. That screams positive regression. Now, Zeke did total more receiving touchdowns last year than his first 2 seasons in the league, but he was also used a lot more as a pass catcher. He had 95 targets last year versus his 39 in his rookie year and 38 during his 10-game 2017 season. Honestly, this is all why I have Zeke as my number 1 player in fantasy football this year. From week 9 through week 17, which is when Amari Cooper joined the Cowboys and they became more pass heavy. During that span, the Cowboys were 9th in yards per drive in football. Pre-Amari Cooper, they ranked 23rd. And Elliott's numbers benefited from this. Without Cooper last year, Zeke saw about 17.5% of Dallas's pass attempts. That totaled 36 targets. With Amari Cooper, Zeke saw over 21% of Dallas's attempts, and that was in a more pass-heavy offense. He had 59 targets in his final 8 games. So in his first 7, he averaged a little over 5 targets per contest. In his final 8, he averaged 7.4. This is what happens when a team starts to throw the ball more, and when a player also starts to see a higher percentage of the team's targets. The two combined means that there's a lot of targets going one player's way. But the low-key benefit to the Cowboys having Amari Cooper and not being so run-heavy is that they'll likely have more opportunities for scoring. So even if Dak continues to see work close to the goal line, there's going to be more overall work to spread around that offense. So Elliott can still safely be projected to see a lot of work in the red zone and close to the goal line. And there's also a coordinator change there, which raises the potential ceiling for Ezekiel Elliott. I think George Kittle should be the consensus number 2 tight end in fantasy football. Zach Ertz has plenty of volume-related question marks with the addition of Deshaun Jackson, Dallas Goedert potentially being more involved in that offense, and the Eagles likely to be pretty good this year, leading to more run-heavy game scripts. Now, Kittle has competition, but it's less set-in-stone competition. So volume could easily be on his side. That's the biggest reason to put him ahead of Zach Ertz. Kittle might regress in the yards per target department, which is what I talked about last week. But that efficiency mark is a lot less important than what's going on in the touchdown column. And last year, Kittle only scored 5 times despite breaking the single season yards record at the tight end position. Based on that yardage total and how tight ends have scored per yard over the last 8 years, Kittle should have had closer to 11 touchdowns than 5 touchdowns. Let's just pretend that he scored 11. That's 36 more fantasy points, or 2.3 fantasy points more per game. Add that to his total last year, and he surpasses Travis Kelce as the tight end 1. If that had happened, do you think that the consensus would be viewing George Kittle differently heading into the 2019 season? Yes, of course they would. Now, that's not realistic from a projection standpoint, though. Like I said, Kittle is really unlikely to be as efficient as he was last year, considering 10 yards per target on that many targets is going to be hard to repeat. So if his yardage total is lower, his projected touchdowns using the simple yards to touchdown conversion, that will also be lower. But there's plenty of wiggle room here, you guys. Tight ends have scored on every 130 yards receiving since 2011. 1,000 receiving yards divided by that 130 mark would still put a tight end at almost 8 touchdowns. That's how insanely low George Kittle's touchdown total was last year. And it's not like he wasn't seeing volume in high leverage areas of the field. He had 19 red zone targets. He just converted 2 of them into touchdowns. With Jimmy Garoppolo under center, or honestly just average quarterback play, it's easy to see how that mark can rebound. Now, to be clear, I'm not advocating that you get George Kittle or any other early round tight end here. That's for another episode. I'm merely pointing out that George Kittle did what he did last year with plenty of room for growth, even if that efficiency falls. My projections have Kittle at tight end 2 with over 1,100 yards and between 8 and 9 scores. Only Travis Kelce is better this year at the position. If you listened to this show during the 2018 season, then you might remember me calling Juju Smith-Schuster a buy candidate pretty consistently throughout the year. He was seeing a ton of red zone work, but the touchdowns just weren't matching. And at the end of the season, Juju had just 7 touchdowns, despite finishing only behind Devontae Adams in red zone targets. Based on his yardage total, we should have seen a couple of more scores from Juju. His situation is obviously completely different this year without Antonio Brown. His target share is going to rise, but if the Steelers are a little bit more run heavy, he might not see a huge difference in overall targets. The ceiling is certainly there, but from a projection standpoint, you may not see a big difference in receptions and yards from Juju Smith-Schuster. You might even see a slight decline depending on the direction that offense goes in. That's why Juju is tough to project. I still love his ceiling though, and I love the fact that he was so effective last year even with just 7 scores. So I'm buying him at his average draft position because of that floor-ceiling combo. I'm not the biggest Derek Carr fan in the world, or I'm not a huge fan of his on-field ability. I'm sure he's a nice guy. But there's reason for optimism entering 2019. He's not someone that you'd want to draft in your normal redraft league, but he's someone that you'll likely be streaming this year with the addition of Antonio Brown and Tyrell Williams. If you're shaking your head no right now, you're probably looking at his numbers from last year. He didn't even hit 20 touchdown passes. Why would you want to stream this guy? But of course, this is a positive regression podcast, and positive regression usually has to do with touchdowns. That 20 touchdown mark was pretty low for Derek Carr's standards, and really NFL standards in general. He threw a touchdown on every 3.4% of his pass attempts last year. That was a career low, even worse than his rookie season. His career 4.4% touchdown rate tells us that there's a natural rebound coming this season, hence positive regression. And when you combine that with the new weapons, it makes buying into that rebound a lot easier. No, I'm not drafting Derek Carr, but he's on speed dial as a streaming option. Kerryon Johnson is a very interesting player heading into 2019. I love him as a talent, and I think that he should be a workhorse in the league. But that doesn't really matter if his own coaches don't. If you do a quick yards to touchdowns conversion for Kerryon, you'll see that he should have had a touchdown and a half more than he had last season. But I wanted to bring him up on today's podcast as sort of an example of when a quick conversion like that can go south. Johnson not only had a pretty unsustainable yards per attempt rate last year, which isn't as big of a deal, but he also just wasn't used close to the end zone. He had just 2 goal line rushes last year. So realistically, that touchdown total probably makes a decent amount of sense. And actually, Mike Clay's OTD, or opportunity adjusted touchdowns, had Kerryon at 3.5 touchdowns last year. He scored 4 total times. So he actually did better than expected in the touchdown column. This is just a small example of needing context for all of these players. I see Kerryon as a player with a really big reward if he ends up getting goal line work in that offense. So I think his average draft position is fair right now. But someone on the Lions who has the opposite problem as Kerryon Johnson is my man Babytron. It's Kenny Golladay. He scored 5 times on 1,063 yards last year. That number should have probably been closer to 7. That's based on his yardage total, but he was also 18th in the league in red zone targets, and Clay's OTD had Golladay at over 6 touchdowns as well. The problem with Detroit in general this year is the fact that they'll probably be a little bit more run heavy with Darrell Bevell as offensive coordinator. You might see that as a plus for Kerryon Johnson, but if Johnson isn't seeing the goal line work, it's not really a plus. Because all of a sudden his target total, which are more important than attempts for running backs in fantasy football, his target total is going to fall. And then obviously as a receiver with Kenny Golladay, the same type of target share that he saw last year into this season, that's not going to yield as many targets. I think both are totally fine at their ADP right now, don't get me wrong, but they're not total upside picks. There's a scarier floor to how their season could go than most realize. It's kind of strange that Davante Adams was able to do what he did last season while Aaron Rodgers had the lowest touchdown rate of his entire career. It was 4.2%. You know who had a higher touchdown rate than Aaron Rodgers in 2018? Nick Mullins. That'll surely bounce back. He's got a 6.2% career average. Now, just for fun, if you give Aaron Rodgers that career average on his 597 pass attempts last year, then you're looking at 37 passing touchdowns. He had 25. That's a freaking 72 fantasy point difference across the entire season. I don't think Rodgers is the QB1 in fantasy this year, or I wouldn't be drafting him as the QB1. But if there's a time to buy Aaron Rodgers, it would probably be right now. And that all depends on how the rest of your league is viewing him, of course. Rodgers' play directly impacted pretty much every pass catcher on Green Bay not named Davante Adams. This may be surprising for some of you to hear, but Jimmy Graham was actually 6th in the NFL last year in tight end targets. He was 14th in red zone targets. And even still, on a team with Aaron Rodgers, Jimmy Graham had 2 touchdowns. Now, maybe that's just because Jimmy Graham is bad now. Maybe he's never going to be the player that we once saw ever again, or even a fraction of that player. But opportunity-wise, Graham should have had probably double the amount of scores that he actually had. But Marquez Valdes-Scantling underperformed in the touchdown column too. He had an opportunity-adjusted touchdown total of 3.1, but he scored just twice. This is a reason to be bullish on the Packers in general this year. There's a new coaching staff, there's a new offense, and Aaron Rodgers won't be as bad as he was last year statistically. If he plays the full 16, I can almost guarantee it. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you got to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And if you're on iTunes, please do me a favor and leave a rating and review. And you can follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. There won't be a mailbag show this week because of the holiday. So to all of you Americans out there, enjoy your 4th of Julys, and I'll be back in your ears next week.